I've never been much for speeches. I've always believed a man's work ought to do most of the talking. But tonight, I want to tell you something that changed my life, something that has nothing to do with cameras, scripts, or movie sets. 5 years ago, if you'd told me I'd be standing here talking about prayer, about sitting still in silence every morning, I would have laughed you off the porch. I was a man of action, always moving, always building the next thing. But life has a funny way of humbling you, of slowing you down when you least expect it. I'd spent decades chasing goals, collecting trophies, shaking hands with presidents, and working with legends. From the outside, it looked like the kind of life any kid from Oakland would have killed for. But somewhere between the premieres and the long nights on set, something went missing. It wasn't money or success. I had plenty of that. What I lost was quieter, harder to name. Maybe it was peace. Maybe it was meaning. Maybe it was myself. I remember waking up one morning on my ranch in Carmel. The world outside was still just the sound of the wind and the ocean somewhere far off. You'd think that kind of silence would bring peace, but it didn't. I felt a restlessness I couldn't shake, like I'd been running a race that didn't have a finish line. That's when a friend of mine, an old cowboy who'd been through more storms than I could count, said something that stopped me cold. He said, "Clint, you've spent your whole life talking. When's the last time you listened?" I didn't have an answer. That question hit me like a punch to the gut. I realized I'd been so busy being the director of everything my films, my life, that I hadn't stopped to listen to the one director who's really in charge. That was the night I made a decision. I was going to start listening. Not just for a few minutes when things got rough, but for real, every morning, in the quiet. No script, no performance, just me and God. At first it felt strange, like a man trying to hear a song after standing too long beside a jet engine. But as the days passed, the noise inside me started to fade. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years: stillness. You see, success can make a lot of noise. It can fill your head with applause and expectations until you can't hear your own heartbeat. But silence has a way of introducing you to yourself again. That's what prayer did for me. It didn't make me religious, it made me real. It reminded me that before I was a filmmaker, a celebrity, or even a man of ambition, I was a soul, a simple, listening soul. And that, my friends, is where the real story of my life began. You spend your whole life chasing something: success, respect, a name that means something, and one day you wake up realizing you caught it, but somewhere along the way, you dropped a piece of yourself. That's what happened to me. I'd been blessed beyond reason, more movies than I can count, awards lined up on the shelves, people shaking my hand like I'd done something remarkable. I'd built an empire out of celluloid and long days under the California sun. But when the lights dimmed and the applause faded, there were nights I'd lie awake wondering why it all felt so quiet inside. Don't get me wrong, I was grateful. But gratitude doesn't fill an empty space, and I had one. It wasn't depression, not exactly. It was more like standing in the middle of a crowd and feeling invisible. You see, when you spend your whole life climbing mountains, you don't realize how lonely the top can be. The air gets thin up there, and even the view starts to lose its color after a while. I remember finishing a film that won more awards than I ever expected. Everyone called it a triumph. But when I got home, I sat in my chair, looked around at a room full of trophies, and felt nothing. No spark, no pride, just silence. That kind of silence isn't peaceful, it's hollow. I'd built my life around doing, achieving, producing, but never around being. That's a dangerous thing, because when the doing stops, you start to wonder who you really are without it. I'd always thought success would be the cure for uncertainty, but it only made the questions louder. What now? What's it all for? I had everything a man could ask for, except the one thing I couldn't buy: peace. Maybe that's what success does. It teaches you that there's more to life than applause, more than the next project, more than the headlines. I used to think slowing down was weakness, that reflection was for dreamers. But I've learned the hardest thing for a man to do is stop long enough to face himself. I had to learn that the noise I'd been chasing, the awards, the work, the admiration, wasn't life. Life was the quiet between the applause, the stillness that asks you, are you proud of who you've become, not just what you've done? That question haunted me for years. And that's when I knew something had to change, not in my career, but in my soul. I live on a ranch in Carmel. You'd think a place like that, a stretch of quiet hills, the ocean wind whispering through the pines, would calm a man down. But peace isn't something you can buy with land or scenery. I'd wake up before dawn, same as always, pour a cup of coffee, watch the sun climb over the horizon. From the outside, it looked perfect. But inside, there was this low hum of restlessness I couldn't shake. It wasn't about work or age or even legacy. It was deeper, like something in me had gone missing. You can have all the success in the world and still feel like a man staring at a blank page. I'd been raised around faith. My grandmother used to kneel by her bed every morning, whispering prayers in the half-light. Back then, I thought prayer was something old folks did when they ran out of options. As I got older, I kept a little of that belief, like a souvenir from childhood, something you keep on the shelf but don't really use. I believed in God, sure, but belief and relationship are two very different things. Mine was polite, distant. I'd throw up a quick prayer when I needed something, or when things went right, but it was more of a nod than a conversation. And when the house got quiet, that's when the questions crept in. Why did I feel so incomplete, even with a full life? Why did silence make me uneasy? It's funny, when we're young, we think motion is meaning. We measure life by what we build, how fast we move, how loud the applause is. But one morning, sitting there with my coffee going cold, I realized I'd been moving for so long I'd forgotten where I was going. Maybe you felt that too, that strange ache that success can't cure. That morning I looked out across the fields, the mist rising off the grass, and I thought, there has to be more. Not more fame or fortune. More of something invisible, something that can't be earned or directed. I didn't know it then, but what I was feeling wasn't failure, it was hunger. The kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food and everything to do with the soul. I was a man surrounded by beauty, and yet I couldn't find peace inside myself. That's when it hit me. Maybe what was missing wasn't out there. Maybe it was the quiet voice inside I'd stopped listening to a long time ago. One evening, I was sitting on the porch with an old friend, a man I've known longer than some of my films have been around. He's one of those people life couldn't break, no matter how hard it tried. He'd been through hell, loss, and heartbreak, and somehow came out the other side with a calm that made you wonder what he'd found that the rest of us hadn't. We were talking about life, about getting older, about how time has a way of stripping away everything that doesn't matter until you're left face to face with yourself. I told him about the restlessness I'd been feeling, the sense that something was missing no matter how much I'd done. He just looked at me for a while, then asked quietly, "When's the last time you just sat still and listened?" I laughed at first, figured he was talking about music or the ocean, but he meant something deeper. "You've spent your whole life directing," he said. "Always talking, creating, pushing forward, but when was the last time you listened to God, to your own soul?" That question hit me harder than I expected. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been truly still without planning my next move. My life had been built around motion, film sets, travel, meetings, always the next thing. Stillness felt foreign, maybe even a little dangerous. He went on to tell me about something he called the 1-hour prayer rule. Every morning before the sun came up, he spent 1 hour in silence. No requests, no to-do lists, no noise. Just listening, opening his heart to whatever God might want to say. I remember shaking my head. "An hour?" I said. "You know how much I could get done in an hour?" He smiled and said, "Maybe that's the problem." There was something in his voice, something steady, grounded, that got under my skin. I'd known men who were rich, powerful, famous, but this man had something rare, peace, the kind of peace you can't fake. I found myself envying it. That night, lying in bed, I kept hearing his words, "When's the last time you just listened?" It echoed in the quiet like a challenge. So I made a decision. I didn't know what I was doing or what I was looking for, but the next morning I set my alarm for 3:30 a.m. I figured if I could give hours to a movie, I could give one to my soul. I didn't know it then, but that question, just one simple question, was about to change everything. That first morning, I'll be honest, it felt ridiculous. The alarm went off at 3:30 a.m., and for a minute, I almost talked myself out of it. But something in me said, "You've faced tougher scenes than this, get up." So I did. I walked out to the porch, the air still cold and heavy, the kind of quiet that only exists before dawn. I sat down in my old wooden chair, the one I usually use to watch the sunrise with a cup of coffee, and I just sat. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. My friend had said, "Just listen," but no one tells you what to do when your mind starts screaming in the silence. I said softly, "God, I'm here, I'm listening." Then I waited. Nothing happened. Not a whisper, not a sign, just me, the dark, and the sound of crickets. My mind, though, it wasn't quiet. It ran wild, thinking about a script I needed to finish, a call I had to make, a broken fence out back. I checked my watch after what felt like an hour. It had been 20 minutes. I laughed under my breath, thinking, "You're losing your touch, old man." But I stayed. Because I've learned one thing in life. If something feels too hard to do, it probably means you need to do it. The next morning I came back, same time, same chair, and the morning after that, every day I fought the same battle with my own thoughts, my impatience, my need to fill every silence with movement or meaning. The first week felt like trying to tame a wild horse with bare hands. But slowly, something started to shift. I wasn't hearing voices or seeing visions, nothing dramatic like that. I was just learning how to be still. I realized how long it had been since I'd allowed myself to just be. Not Clint Eastwood, the actor, not the director, not the guy with plans and responsibilities, just a man breathing in the quiet. It's funny how uncomfortable that can be, facing your own mind with no distractions to hide behind. But I kept showing up, every morning at 3:30, because something deep inside told me this was a fight worth having. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones with fists or words, they're the ones fought in silence, in the still places where you finally meet yourself. And even though nothing seemed to be happening on the outside, something unseen was beginning to move on the inside. By the third week, something unexpected happened. I was sitting in that same old chair before dawn, eyes closed, breathing steady, when out of nowhere a picture flickered across my mind, soft, quiet, like an old film reel playing in the dark. I was a kid again, maybe 7 or 8, standing in the hallway of my grandmother's house in Oakland, the smell of coffee and soap, the sound of a clock ticking. I peeked into her room and saw her kneeling beside her bed, hands folded, eyes closed. She wasn't talking, not moving, just completely still. I remember thinking how peaceful she looked, like she wasn't even in the same world. When she opened her eyes and saw me, she smiled, patted the floor next to her, and whispered, "Come pray with me, sweetheart." I knelt beside her, trying to copy what she did. We sat there in silence for what felt like forever, and then she said, "God is always talking, Clint. The trick is getting quiet enough to hear him." That memory hit me like a lightning bolt. I'd buried it under 60 years of noise, movies, fame, ambition, life. But sitting there on that porch decades later, I realized she'd been right all along. God hadn't gone silent, I had. He'd been speaking through every sunrise, every heartbreak, every lucky break, every moment of grace I'd mistaken for coincidence. I just hadn't been quiet enough to listen. That realization cracked something open in me. I felt this wave, grief, gratitude, humility all at once. I thought of all the years I'd spent chasing success, trying to prove myself, while the most important conversation of my life had been waiting in the background. I remembered her voice again, calm and sure. He's always talking. And I knew then that the silence I'd been fighting wasn't empty, it was full. Full of the presence I'd been too busy to notice. I sat there until the first light of dawn spilled across the hills, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel restless. I didn't feel alone. I felt heard. That was the morning I stopped treating prayer like a chore and started seeing it for what it really is, a reunion with the one who'd been there all along, waiting for me to get quiet enough to remember. After that morning, everything started to shift. What began as a discipline slowly turned into something sacred. That hour on the porch wasn't just silence anymore, it was communion. It was like walking into a quiet room where truth was already waiting for me, I didn't hear any booming voice from the heavens, no grand visions or revelations. What I heard was softer, steadier, the kind of truth that comes wrapped in peace. I started to see things about myself I'd been too busy or too proud to notice. God has a way of holding up a mirror that doesn't lie. In that silence, He showed me how much of my life had been built on the idea of self-reliance, of proving myself, of being the man who didn't need help from anyone. I'd worn toughness like armor, convinced it was strength, but it was really a shield, a way to keep people from getting too close, and to keep me from feeling too much. It's strange how you can conquer the world and still lose touch with your own heart. I saw how often I'd chosen work over people, the birthdays I'd missed, the words I never said, the moments I let slip away because I thought there would always be more time. I saw the pride that made me believe every success was mine alone, when in truth every opportunity had been a gift. But alongside all that came grace. Not judgment, not shame grace. The kind that whispers, you can still change. It's not too late. I began to understand that prayer wasn't about performance. It was about presence. It wasn't about asking for things. It was about remembering who I was and who'd been with me all along. And that realization, that quiet awakening, began to spill into every part of my life. I found myself softer with people, more patient. I listened more than I spoke. I stopped trying to control every outcome and started trusting that maybe I didn't have to. The peace that grew from those mornings didn't come all at once. It came slow, like the sunrise, one shade at a time. And as it did, I started to feel more alive than I had in years. It turns out that strength isn't about how much you can carry or how many battles you can fight. Real strength is learning to be still enough to let God remake you from the inside out. That's what that hour gave me. Not answers, not perfection, but a new heart and a quieter kind of power. About 6 months into this new rhythm of quiet, something happened that I'll never forget. It wasn't dramatic, no thunder, no flash of light, just a still morning like any other. I was sitting there, coffee cooling beside me, when a question came to mind as clear as if someone had whispered it. What do you want to be remembered for? At first I brushed it off. I'd been asked that question plenty of times by journalists, film students, even old friends. I always had a polished answer ready, something about storytelling, about making films that mattered. But that morning the question hit deeper, like it bypassed my mind and went straight for my soul. I sat there in the silence and realized I didn't want my legacy to be a list of movies or awards. I didn't want the last line of my story to be about fame or fortune. What I truly wanted was to be remembered as someone who loved well, someone who pointed others toward something greater than themselves, someone who lived for more than applause. That realization changed everything. I started to look at my life differently, through a softer lens. I thought about my kids, my friends, the people I'd worked with over the years. Had I really been present with them, or had I been too busy chasing perfection? I thought about the sets I'd directed, the long hours, the relentless focus, and how rarely I'd stopped to ask how people were really doing. Somewhere along the way I'd confused excellence with meaning. But they're not the same thing. Excellence is about how well you do something. Meaning is about why you do it. From that day forward, that question, what do you want to be remembered for, became the compass for every choice I made. I started choosing projects not just because they were good stories, but because they were true stories, stories that said something worth saying. I began to treat every conversation as if it might be the last one I'd ever have with that person, because one day it will be. My relationships changed, my work changed, even my days felt different, less rushed, more deliberate. You see, legacy isn't built by what you leave behind, it's built by how you love while you're here. And maybe the greatest success isn't what people remember about you, but how your life helps them remember what matters. That morning, I stopped thinking about how I wanted to be remembered and started thinking about how I wanted to live. There came a point when I finally understood that I wasn't the one directing this movie called life. For decades, I'd lived like I was the man behind the camera, calling the shots, rewriting scenes, trying to control every outcome. But life doesn't work that way. It's not a script you can edit or a scene you can reshoot. It's something you have to surrender to. I started to see God as the real director, the one who sees the full picture, while I'm just focused on the frame in front of me. At first, surrender didn't come easy. It went against everything I'd built my life on: discipline, control, precision. I was a man who believed that if you worked hard enough, you could shape destiny. But the more I prayed, the more I realized how much of life isn't meant to be forced, it's meant to be trusted. That trust was tested plenty of times. A film that fell apart after years of planning, A health scare that reminded me how fragile even the strongest man can be. Doors that closed without explanation, relationships that shifted, losses that cut deep. In the past, I would have fought those things tooth and nail, tried to fix them, control them, make them fit my plan. But something was different now. I started taking those things into prayer, laying them down instead of wrestling them to the ground. I'd say, God, I don't understand this, but I trust you. And every single time, peace followed. Not always answers, but peace. It reminded me of a verse my grandmother used to quote, "Be still and know that I am God." I used to think be still meant do nothing. Now I know it means let go. Stop trying to play both roles, actor and director, and trust that the story's in good hands. That simple truth changed how I faced everything. When things went wrong, I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what are you teaching me? I began to see that sometimes the setbacks were saving me from something I couldn't see. That the waiting, the silence, even the disappointments, they weren't punishment, they were preparation. And when you finally accept that, when you stop forcing and start trusting, life begins to flow again. I used to think strength meant never breaking. But now I know the strongest thing a man can do is surrender, not in defeat, but in faith. Because when you finally stop fighting for control, that's when you find the kind of peace no success in this world can buy. I'm 84 now, and when I look back, I can tell you straight the hour I gave to silence each morning changed my life more than any movie, award, or moment of fame ever did. I used to think success was about how loud the world applauds when you walk into a room, but real success, I've learned, is how peaceful it feels when you sit alone in the quiet. That hour with God became my anchor. It taught me that peace doesn't come from control, but from surrender. It reminded me that we spend most of our lives running from failure, from pain, from stillness, but peace isn't found in the running, it's found in the stopping. When I started giving that 1 hour to prayer, it wasn't about religion or ritual, it was about relationship. A conversation without words. A quiet place where I could breathe, listen, and remember what really matters. The strange thing about silence is that it starts to speak to you. It tells you truths you've been too busy to hear, that love matters more than legacy, that people matter more than power, and that life isn't about what you achieve but who you become in the process. Those mornings changed how I saw everything. My work became less about perfection and more about purpose. My relationships grew deeper. I learned to forgive quicker, to speak softer, to listen longer. Even the hard days didn't shake me the way they used to, because I'd found something unshakable. Every time I sat in that chair before sunrise, I could feel the same quiet presence my grandmother once showed me when I was a boy. She was right all along. God is always talking. The question is, are we quiet enough to listen? If you're searching for peace, I'll tell you what I learned. Start with silence. You don't need a church, a preacher, or a perfect prayer. Just a quiet place, a few minutes of honesty, and an open heart. That's where the noise of the world fades, and the voice that's been waiting for you all along finally speaks. At my age, I don't know how many mornings I have left, but I know this. The richest years of my life weren't the ones filled with lights and cameras. They were the ones spent in the dark before dawn, in the stillness, talking with the one who gave me breath. And if that's all I'm remembered for, that's enough.